This is an ABC podcast.
Hello, welcome to PM. I'm Linda Mottram. Tonight, emails reveal Pfizer urgently seeking high-level talks with the federal government months before a vaccine deal was done. Also, the latest Australian review shows limited COVID spread in schools, but a leading epidemiologist pleads for countermeasures before locked-down classes resume.
The classrooms are going to have to get assessed, and it may be that you can't air condition the classroom down to 24 degrees. There are ways to balance, kind of ensuring there's ventilation and maintaining a tolerable temperature. It might not be the usual temperature that you have in the classroom.
And the High Court finds media outlets responsible not just for their articles, but for comments on their Facebook pages too.
What it means is every individual who has a Facebook profile, every small organisation, community group that has a Facebook profile is potentially liable for any defamatory comments that might be posted by third parties.
Welcome to the program. Newly released emails have shone new light on the Morrison government's efforts to buy vaccines for the nation, which ultimately led to a slow and troubled rollout. They reveal the Health Minister's office did not meet with Pfizer executives until a fortnight after both the USA and the UK had already signed deals for COVID-19 vaccines. This was despite the pharmaceutical giant imploring Scott Morrison's government to show urgency. Let's go to our political reporter James Glenday in Canberra. James, how did these documents come to light?
They were obtained by the federal opposition under freedom of information laws, and they show that Pfizer contacted the government in June last year and it offered to supply millions of vaccines by the end of 2020, the end of last year, which of course would have been very useful. It warned at the time that vaccine development was a swift-moving area and that competition for supply was pretty fierce. 3 days after that initial contact, a health department official responded saying she would meet with the company's leaders, not the Health Minister's office, and it wasn't until 2 weeks after the UK and the US had done deals with the company that the Minister's office actually met with Pfizer. And of course it wasn't until November, 4 months after the company's first offer, that the Morrison government actually did a deal to buy 10 million doses to be delivered this year. And as we know now, Pfizer has basically become the backbone of Australia's rollout because of the safety advice surrounding the AstraZeneca vaccine. Labor's health spokesperson Mark Butler claims that these emails, these documents reveal the original sin of the vaccine rollout, the thing that first went wrong, which have caused cascading problems, namely a slow rollout and now lockdowns.
Scott Morrison's failure to secure an early supply deal with Pfizer mean that right now more Australians are in lockdown and fewer are fully vaccinated than any other developed country in the world. That is the price being paid by the Australian people for Scott Morrison's failures.
Labor's health spokesman Mark Butler there. James, how has the government responded to this news?
Well, in a slightly strange way. The Health Minister, Greg Hunt, issued a statement which says that Labor's claims are false, and he accuses the opposition of selectively misusing the emails obtained under FOI. We do need to remember that in June last year, it was pretty unclear which vaccines would work. Australia was hoping the UQ jab would be used. AstraZeneca was looking pretty promising at the time, and it had the added benefit of allowing us to make the vaccines here domestically. And mRNA vaccines hadn't been used on the mass scale that they are now. So hindsight is a wonderful thing. But this afternoon, the government sent out one of Parliament's nice guys, the Trade Minister Dan Tehan, to front the media. He was there to speak in general terms about the use of a vaccine passport for international travel, but he was also obviously expected to give a holding line and effectively block questions about these Pfizer emails. And as you'll hear now, Linda, he had a bit of a tough time of it.
So the Health Minister has put out a statement on this, and he's been very clear. So I am answering the question. He put out a statement. The statement's very clear. This is a selective use of emails. It doesn't tell the full story. And his statement is very, very clear that this is false. I'll take one more question. Thank you. You look at Minister Hunt's statement. Yeah, okay, and he said it out all very clearly there. It is the select use of emails under an FOI request, which only ended up with a select group of emails. Thanks very much.
Dan Tehan trying to unsuccessfully deflect questions there. James, what's the likely political fallout of this?
Yeah, it's a good question. The federal opposition is shouting this from the rooftops, as you'd expect, basically saying Scott Morrison didn't buy enough vaccines and therefore let Australia down. They've even cut up an ad that's going to be rolled out from today. I think the overall impact of this is that it's just going to add to the controversy that already surrounds the vaccine rollout, and I think the political effect of that really depends on how much benefit of the doubt people are willing to give the Morrison government. Some will. A pandemic is a particularly rare and challenging event, of course, and some won't, because there have been a lot of problems. Certainly the line that Labor is running, that Scott Morrison didn't buy enough vaccines, is a particularly damaging one. And so by the time the election rolls around in March or maybe May, I think the PM's prospects do hinge a lot on a very high percentage of people being vaccinated, hospitals not being overwhelmed, and of course normal life returning as much as is possible.
OK, thanks very much, James. James Glenday in Canberra. Well, protecting school children from COVID is becoming a critical issue in New South Wales, and it's not clear authorities have a clear strategy. School is due to resume next month, and there are fears about the risk that presents for the spread of the virus. Policymakers claim unvaccinated kids don't present a clear and present danger to the community, but some epidemiologists have a different view. Meanwhile, the Delta variant continues to threaten inner city Sydney, a battleground that experts say we can't afford to lose. David Taylor has more.
A hopeful New South Wales Premier, thrilled at the rapid pace of vaccination across the state.
Good morning, everybody. Pleasingly, New South Wales has satisfied another important hurdle. 75% of our state have at least the first dose of vaccine.
42% of the eligible New South Wales population is now fully vaccinated. Hit the 70% mark, she promises, and life will improve, at least for those with 2 doses of the vaccine.
But I'm extremely optimistic that at 70% double dose, everybody who is vaccinated will enjoy life much more freely than what we do today, and that's a commitment we've made from day one.
But for now, the daily pandemic scorecard remains grim. In the 24 hours to 8 p.m. last night, New South Wales recorded 1,480 new locally acquired COVID-19 cases. 9 people died with the virus in the reporting period. And the number of people requiring care for COVID-19 continues to expand, as New South Wales Health's Marianne Gale explains.
Currently, there are about 11,000 people with COVID-19 who are being cared for by New South Wales Health.
Unvaccinated children remain a key question around the spread of the virus. Professor Christine McCartney is from the National Centre for Immunisation Research. She and her team have been tracking the spread of the virus since the beginning of the pandemic. They've revealed the results of their 5th report, which covers the 6-week period between mid-June to mid-July, where there were COVID-19 cases in 51 educational facilities.
So of those 51 sites where there was a case, there was actually the majority that did not have any onward spread of the virus to teachers, staff or children.
The risk, though, is the spread of the virus from students to unvaccinated parents. The question then is, what's the most effective way to stop the virus spreading in schools? Well, Gladys Berejiklian says she has a detailed plan for the reopening of schools, which included options for opening windows. But when pushed by a reporter to provide more information on what a classroom full of students would look like...
Well, I think I'll ask the Professor to answer that question.
Melbourne University epidemiologist Nancy Baxter concedes children are overwhelmingly handling COVID infections well. But she says it's vital that every school be closely reviewed and fitted out with whatever is necessary to keep students and staff COVID safe.
That the classrooms are going to have to get assessed, and it may be that you can't air condition the classroom down to, 24 degrees, that you have to accept it's going to be a bit warmer.
She welcomes Victoria's approach to monitoring ventilation in classrooms.
In Melbourne, so CO2 monitoring and installation of air filters for spaces where, the CO2 monitoring shows there's not adequate ventilation.
And she says state and territory governments need to seriously consider mandatory mask wearing for all students. Elsewhere, COVID-19 is still spreading and threatening critical areas of the state. Marianne Gale from New South Wales Health says COVID-19 has been detected in sewage at Bonny Hills, an area of the mid-north coast. But it's inner city Sydney that has authorities on high alert.
We're also concerned about case numbers in the areas of Glebe, Waterloo, Redfern and Marrickville. And I'd like to encourage the residents of those suburbs as well to please come forward for vaccination.
Epidemiologist Nancy Baxter says a surge in virus cases closer to the city centre could be the straw that ultimately breaks the state's healthcare system.
You know, it could be the straw that breaks the camel's back. You know what I mean?
Epidemiologist Nancy Baxter. David Taylor with that report. Well, it's week 4 of hard lockdown for the tiny New South Wales town of Wilcannia, with more than 100 COVID cases there and 100 ADF personnel camped on the football oval. The response has finally amped up. But locals in the predominantly Indigenous community are worried about another deadly problem that's emerging: deteriorating mental health and anxiety over COVID and the lack of a future plan for the town. Here's our reporter Carly Williams.
When the tiny outback town of Wilcannia was first hit by the Delta strain, the one supermarket was forced to shut and homes literally ran out of food. 4 weeks into the community's lockdown, more than 100 COVID cases later, there's now food in pantries, but there's a new problem.
You've got young mums having anxiety attacks, panic attacks, you know, because they're fearing the worst.
Monica Kerwin is a Barkindji woman and has lived in Wilcannia her whole life. She's heartbroken seeing people's mental health deteriorate.
You know, a lot of people here, when they got tested positive, said, you know, we just didn't know. You know, it's heartbreaking for them to know that they passed it on to some of the children in the house, and that broke them even more. You know, the old black dog was creeping in on top of this virus, you know. And people would have been thinking down that line, and a lot of them were.
Wilcannia, with its heritage sandstone buildings and outback red dirt, sits on the Darling River, the Barker. It's home to about 700 people, and the next town is 2 hours away. Overcrowded housing has been recognised for years as a public health issue. The Aboriginal Medical Service Marima warned the federal government 18 months ago that, quote, urgent and drastic action was needed to prepare Wilcannia for COVID. New South Wales Health Minister Brad Hazzard visited Wilcannia on Tuesday. Community leader Brendan Adams asked him why Wilcannia was left to go it alone.
The impact of the COVID in Wilcannia came in, it was like a cyclone. A lot of people was unprepared. Were you kind of shocked how hard it hit our community?
I was shocked that the preparation levels had not been what I thought they were. And I think that the state obviously understood that there was certain work being done up here already by the federal government. It appears that it had been a bit, but not as much as we really needed.
Monica Kerwin wanted to speak to the minister, but was told no.
Like, I've called a man out to come out here and he couldn't even have the decency to invite me to their table to even question him.
You weren't invited? He didn't ask to, you didn't get to meet him?
No.
Monica Kerwin wanted to ask the minister why there wasn't a plan for Wilcannia. And what's the plan now, especially when it comes to emotional well-being? Bardia woman and psychologist Professor Pat Dudgeon is an expert in the mental health space.
The anxiety levels will be incredible. It's probably like, you know, the worst case situation happening for Aboriginal communities is happening in Wilcannia now.
She says the fabric of Aboriginal life has been impacted, connection to each other and connection to country.
Go for walks, connect back with country, because, you know, you will be allowed to do some exercise. It'll be limited, but it's an opportunity for you to connect back with nature.
Monica Kerwin has a warning to all Indigenous communities across Australia.
Get your grassroots plan in now. Take a look at what's happening in Wilcannia and start putting your zone plan in place. Your food security, your medical security, you know, isolation security, to isolate your own people. Have something ready. Do not wait on the Australian government, because they will fail you like they've failed us.
And the Far West Local Health District that looks after Wilcannia told PM, quote, mental health, drug and alcohol service is part of the community response team in Wilcannia, with staff specialising in adult mental health, drug and alcohol and child and adolescent mental health care.
Carly Williams with that report. You're listening to PM on the radio, on the ABC Listen app and via the podcast. I'm Linda Mottram. Ahead, no sign for Afghanistan of the Taliban's promised inclusive government as the newly declared Islamic Emirates interim cabinet is unveiled. Well, in a significant ruling today, the High Court has found that media organisations could be liable for defamatory comments made by members of the public on media outlets' social media pages. The case is part of a defamation action being taken by former Northern Territory detainee Dylan Voller, who is seeking to sue several outlets for comments made about him on Facebook. The decision is the first of its kind in Australia, and experts warn it could have a significant chilling effect on the kind of commentary allowed on social media. Bridget Fitzgerald reports.
There you go. Yeah, no worries. All right, you keep chilling me out, yeah?
A teenage boy strapped to a chair, shirtless with a hood over his head. Then 18-year-old Dylan Voller was a detainee at Darwin's Dondale Detention Centre. An investigation by the ABC's Four Corners program and the sharing of this footage sparked a royal commission into youth detention in the NT. It also resulted in a significant amount of public scrutiny on Mr Voller. He launched defamation action against Fairfax Media, Nationwide News and Sky News after their Facebook posts attracted critical comments about him. The latest question before the High Court has been whether media companies can be responsible for comments made by other people. Today, the High Court found they are.
No case of that kind, to my knowledge, has reached the ultimate appellate court of the country, and for it to deliver a judgment on these interesting questions is really definitive as to the position in Australian law.
Dr Matt Collins QC is a Melbourne barrister specialising in defamation. He's acted as an advisor to Facebook and to many of Australia's media companies on the issue. Lawyers for the media groups had argued that while they may have facilitated the process, they weren't the publishers of any defamatory material. Matt Collins QC says the High Court decision finds that as it was published on their pages, it is their responsibility.
Well, I think it really requires mainstream media organisations to reflect upon the risks of continuing to make their content available via third-party social media services such as Facebook, at least in circumstances where they don't have control sufficient to enable them to disable access to defamatory or other problematic material when it is posted.
And what about beyond that? What about smaller organisations, community groups or, local blogs?
Well, I think every user of social media services should be concerned about the implications of the majority decision of the High Court. What it means is every individual who has a Facebook profile, every small organisation, community group that has a Facebook profile is potentially liable for any defamatory comments that might be posted by third parties, even where they haven't solicited or provoked them, and even where they're not aware of their content. And the advice I would give to anyone who operates a social media profile is to monitor for comments, and where defamatory comments are posted, the safe course is always to remove or disable access to them.
This is going to change everything, really.
Andrew Dodds, the Director of the Centre for Advancing Journalism at the University of Melbourne.
I'm afraid that the effect for many media companies will be to just shut down the comment streams. It'll be to turn off those channels whereby people can make comments that are defamatory, and that will chill public comment and discussion about what's going on in the news.
However, this is an issue that will be looked at further. Dr Matt Collins QC says there's a law reform process underway which is expected to be finalised in the second half of next year.
The State and Territory Attorneys General are currently consulting in relation to what's called Round 2 of the defamation law reforms, one aspect of which is to bring into the 21st century Australia's laws around online publication.
The High Court decision means Dylan Voller can continue civil action against the media companies.
Bridget Fitzgerald with that report. Well, controversy is swirling over the appointment of human trafficking specialist Lorraine Finlay as Australia's new Human Rights Commissioner. The federal opposition and sexual abuse advocates are critical of views that she's expressed in the past, in particular against affirmative consent laws. Ms Finlay says there can be different views about law reform while still sharing a firm commitment to condemning violence and protecting victims. Jamie Travers reports.
The new Human Rights Commissioner doesn't start in her new job until November, but she's already drawn criticism, including from the current Australian of the Year at this week's National Women's Safety Summit, commenting on Ms Finlay's position on affirmative consent.
This position of Human Rights Commissioner, this is a power position, and also, it's a 5-year tenure. What could have been a really progressive step has actually been a backwards one amid this summit.
Grace Tame speaking at a panel yesterday criticising the choice of Lorraine Finlay as Human Rights Commissioner over previous comments about affirmative consent she'd made, like these from 2018 in a video with men's rights commentator Bettina Arndt.
Affirmative consent is a great moral code. It's a really bad legal standard. So, of course, we should be encouraging people to ensure that there's consent and to make sure that they're not taking chances when it comes to sexual relationships. But to enforce that in a legal code is a different thing altogether.
And she's not the only campaigner concerned by Miss Finlay's appointment. Saxon Mullins is the Director of Advocacy at Rape and Sexual Assault Research and Advocacy. She sparked a review of consent laws in New South Wales after revealing details of a sexual encounter she was involved in to Four Corners in 2018 and has been a campaigner for affirmative consent laws ever since.
Being the recipient of one of the human rights medals in the past, to know that she is now their commissioner and she is directly opposed to my work and to my advocacy, that's very personal to me, and I find it really discouraging of the work that the Human Rights Commission are doing.
Lorraine Finlay has addressed the criticism of her stance on affirmative consent, tweeting,
"My views on affirmative consent reforms are views about one specific law reform issue. This is a law reform question that people can have different views about, while sharing a firm commitment to condemning violence and protecting victims."
And it's not just Grace Tame and Saxon Mullins. The federal opposition is also concerned about the position that she's taken on key human rights issues, including appearing in a campaign video against a constitutional voice for Indigenous Australians, alongside members of think tank the Institute of Public Affairs.
So rather than actually elevating Indigenous voices, you diminish them because you say they're only allowed to play a certain prescribed role in the Australian democracy. And that's something that, first of all, is patronising, but second of all, it's a form of political segregation, which is really damaging.
Shadow Attorney General Mark Dreyfus says there are questions about positions that she's taken in the past.
She's written opposing Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act. She's written denouncing the Indigenous voice to Parliament as political segregation. She has denounced serious proposals to improve our sexual assault laws as, using her words, undermining due process and the presumption of innocence.
But the federal government is standing by her appointment, pointing to her time spent as a state prosecutor and a senior trafficking specialist with the Australian mission to ASEAN. Tim Wilson is a Liberal MP and also a former Human Rights Commissioner.
We need a diversity of voices, and if there is debate, that's the job of the Human Rights Commissioner to foster. And so her appointment fulfills exactly what the objective is, to improve the rights and freedoms of every Australian.
For some observers, the appointment highlights the need for a more transparent and impartial appointments process when it comes to bureaucratic appointments. Hugh Kretzer is the Executive Director of the Human Rights Law Centre.
It's absolutely critical that we have an independent, properly resourced and mandated Australian Human Rights Commission. Unfortunately, it appears what's happened here is that the government has gone against best practice process and hand-picked someone for the job.
Head of the Human Rights Law Centre, Hugh de Kretzer, and the Attorney General, Michaela Cash, has sent us a statement highlighting Ms Finlay's experience. And she says, quote, "To suggest Ms Finlay will be anything but a fierce advocate for women is completely unfounded." The full statement will be on our website. Jamie Travers with that report. Well, it's emerging that pro-Pakistan figures have been nudged up the ranks in the Taliban's interim cabinet announced overnight, and anti-Pakistan ones have been demoted. Experts say a visit to Kabul earlier this week by the head of Pakistan's powerful intelligence service, the ISI, was designed to paper over differences between Taliban factions to get some kind of government in place. Of the 33-member cabinet, more than half the members are also sanctioned by the United Nations. Afghanistan, which will now be known again as an Islamic emirate, has no women in the cabinet. There is also no health minister. Indian journalist and author Praveen Swami is a specialist in security issues, including Afghanistan. I asked him how he would headline the announcement.
History repeats itself, but even the second time around, it's not farce. To me, the standout from this cabinet is the number of people who had an important role in, if you like, the first Islamic emirate, engaged in various kinds of behaviors that had, forget 9/11, but awful consequences for the people of Afghanistan, women, ethnic minorities, and indeed the Pashtun majority. And nothing seems to have changed.
Now, ahead of the announcement, the head of the powerful Pakistani intelligence service, the ISI, was spotted in Kabul. Let's just clarify, was his presence connected somehow to this cabinet and how it was shaped?
I'm speculating, but it's no secret that there were deep divisions between the southern leadership of the Taliban, which dominated the first Islamic emirate, and the eastern leadership, or the Haqqani network, which has become increasingly important in military terms to the insurgency since 2008. One plausible explanation is that General Faiz Hamid was in Kabul to try and paper over these differences. The ISI has a long, excellent relationship with both factions, and General Faiz was probably there to try and get some government running.
Before this announcement, you wrote a piece focusing on one particular position, that of what translates as Prime Minister, Hassan Akhund, and you quoted a declassified US cable about him, which said he is, quote, considered one of the most ineffective and unreasonable Taliban leaders. So why does he have that job, Praveen?
But that's fascinating, isn't it? I suspect he was something of a compromise candidate between the eastern and southern factions, because despite his religious authority and his presence on the Taliban Rehbari Shura, or its consultative council, he isn't actually a military leader with any significant personal following or military heft of his own. It may well have been that the Eastern leadership was willing to accept him precisely because of that. And the Southern leaders were happy with the fact that he's a Southerner, but again, relatively weak and therefore not a threat to Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar or Mullah Yaqub.
So a weak leader, divisions that are being papered over, and other crises as well, an economic crisis, women and men who've had their freedoms out protesting on the streets. Can this interim cabinet have any chance of squaring that circle, if you like?
I'm really skeptical that even with the best of intentions, which I don't think the Taliban has, this economic crisis would have been easy to resolve. The reality today is that without the massive amounts of dollar aid that was flowing in since 9/11, there's no real possibility that any Afghan government can even afford to do basic state functions like pay salaries, let alone do anything significant to alleviate the enormous hardship across Afghanistan today. Unfortunately and sadly, the Taliban's commanders or powerful ministers will probably not care about this very much. They've run their little empires these last 20 years, basically through extracting revenues from preying on commercial operations and traffic, as well, of course, from narcotics.
So do you anticipate then that it will be a reversion to those fiefdoms that hold on to their territory by those means you've described, by tolls on roads and by running narcotics?
I would imagine so, simply because I don't see that for all the sort of talk that we're getting from some quarters about massive investments by China, for example, that anything of the kind is actually going to happen. The first Taliban emirate turned into an economic waste zone. There's been problems, as everyone knows, these last 20 years with warlordism and criminality. And I suspect much the same lies again until somebody cracks the fundamental problem of building stable central state authority in Afghanistan. this kind of warlordism is going to remain a feature of its politics.
Praveen Swami, very good to speak to you today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Indian journalist and author Praveen Swami, and that is PM for this Wednesday. I'm Linda Mottram. Thank you for listening. Hear the program on the ABC Listen app or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, I'm Angela Pierre.
And I'm Stephen Smiley, and we're from the ABC's daily news podcast, The Signal.
Mining royalties payments to First Nations people in the NT were meant to help close the gap. Instead, many say they're doing serious harm.
Today on The Signal, in the Northern Territory alone, more than $3 billion has been collected in royalties over the past 40 years. So why hasn't all that money lifted communities out of poverty? Look for The Signal on the ABC Listen app or wherever you get your podcasts.
You've been listening to an ABC podcast. Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.